to this podcast, the Heidelminicast.
It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
Is Richard Baxter okay?
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
If you enjoy the Heidelblog, be sure to subscribe at heidelblog.net/subscribe. And if you love the Heidelcast, well, do the same in any good podcast app. We're everywhere that people listen to podcasts. And if you really enjoy the Heidelcast, please give us a 5-star rating and leave a comment, and we'll likely read that comment on the show. If you give us a 5-star rating, that boosts us up the lists, the ratings and the algorithm and all that stuff. And that helps people to find us.
The Heidelcast.
Richard Baxter is an influential figure in the history of Reformed theology. Strangely, tragically, there is a phrase that people use in journalism called burying the lead. It gets spelled a couple of different ways, and since 1979, people have spelled it L-E-D-E, and I don't know why. But it's what they do, and in the lead, the writer is supposed to tell the reader the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the story. At least that's the way news used to be written. That's the way I was taught to write news. Burying the lead has become commonplace as the line between analysis and journalism has been blurred. When I was in the news business, we distinguished sharply between opinion and news. When we wrote the news, we were supposed to keep our opinions out of it. A great example of burying the lead is the way that people frequently talk about Richard Baxter. He died in 1691. Some years ago, I read an article about Baxter, and the author waited until the 11th paragraph to tell us the following, and I quote, "Despite his well-intentioned desires for a unified church, however, some of Baxter's theological positions were unhelpful and divisive. His views on justification and atonement were not in step with the Reformed tradition. Theologian Paul Helm has found similarities between Baxter and N.T. Wright in their views of justification. Moreover, in trying to walk a middle path, Baxter leaned toward Arminian sentiments in several major areas, though he was Calvinistic in others. This assorted theology annoyed contemporaries in both camps, and it can annoy us too." Well, that is remarkable when an author says that denying the gospel is annoying. Well, I mean, it certainly is that, but it seems like it's more than that, more than just, merely annoying.
Is everybody done?
I was just contemplating the Apostle Paul going to the Apostle Peter about refusing to eat with the Gentiles, and thereby, according to the Apostle Paul, denying the gospel. And Paul leading with the words, Peter, I'm really annoyed with you. It just doesn't seem very likely. No, I mean, when someone denies the gospel, you don't just merely get annoyed. You sound the alarm.
Danger, Will Robinson, danger.
This is the emergency broadcast system.
What's wrong with you people?
The fact that it's just merely annoying tells us something about a writer's priorities. But I press on. Because according to many, Baxter was a model Reformed pastor, a tireless advocate for Christian piety, and an evangelist, except that he denied the gospel. So he's a great evangelist, except that he denied the gospel. So the fact that, this only shows up in the 11th paragraph says a lot. It amazes me, really. And the facts of Baxter's theology, piety, and practice should give pause, to put it mildly, to anyone proposing Baxter as a model for Reformed theology, piety, and practice, for Reformed ministry. So let's change the subject of the paragraph to Arminius, because he too was a well-intentioned advocate of Christian unity, and some of his theological positions were unhelpful and divisive. But, of course, you know what the Synod of Dort said about him, don't you? Well, they said that he had brought up out of hell the errors of Pelagius. And the Synod repeatedly called him, his theology, and his followers heretics. They actually used that word. So just by changing the subject from Baxter to Arminius, we see the importance of not burying the lead. We can write all we want about how pious Arminius was and how tireless his service was and how he presented himself to the world, etc. And remember, I guess we should make this clear, he was a minister in the Reformed churches, and he died in good standing in the Reformed churches. He wasn't disciplined during his lifetime. He was even made Rector Magnificus of the University of Leiden. So he was hardly the victim he's been made out to be in some narratives.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
I guess that most who identify with the Reformed theology, piety, and practice don't realize that Baxter effectively scuttled the Reformation doctrine of justification by God's unconditional favor alone, through faith, resting and receiving, and trusting alone. That's sola fide. To put this error in context, one of our early Reformed theologians, J.H. Alstead, said in 1618, the article of justification is said to be the article of the standing or falling of the church, close quote. Calvin called justification the hinge of the Christian faith, and you could find similar quotations throughout the Reformed tradition. As I wrote in Covenant Justification and Pastoral Ministry, Richard Baxter sponsored a great crisis in the doctrine of justification in the Reformed churches. And you can read that article now. It's at heidelblog.net/CJPM, and it's brought to you by the Heidelberg Reformation Association. His 1649 aphorisms on justification taught quite clearly that faith justifies because it obeys. If you're not sure that is accurate, you can check it for yourself. The aphorisms are available online, for example, at Early English Books Online. And you can look at the Heidelblog essay, Richard Baxter on Initial and Final Justification Through Faith and Works. And we'll try to link that to the show notes for this episode. In contrast to Baxter's doctrine of justification, the Westminster Larger Catechism, I'm thinking of questions 70 through 73, was explicit that only Christ's obedience is the ground, and that, in the act of justification, faith's only virtue is Christ's finished work. In other words, there's no intrinsic virtue to faith itself. Baxter's revision of the doctrine of justification prompted a sharp response from John Owen, who published a response in 1677 in his treatise on the doctrine of justification by faith. And that, I think, is volume 5 in Owen's works. And it is an extended repudiation of Baxter's doctrine. As he damaged the Reformed cause by signing evangelicals and Catholics together, which document was the original impetus for the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, so too J.I. Packer did not help the cause of Reformed and truly traditionally evangelical theology by downplaying in his D.Phil thesis, published in 2003, Baxter's errors on justification. Even Packer, however, has called Baxter a neo-nomian. In 1992, he compared the theology of Norman Shepherd to Richard Baxter, and I quote Packer, Shepherd, in effect, reinvented the neo-nomianism of Richard Baxter in the 17th century, and from the same motive. recoil from the practical antinomianism that surrounded him and a desire to state the gospel as to make perfectly obvious that persevering holiness is enjoined on all who hope to be welcomed by Christ the Lord on the day of judgment. Like Baxter, he never understood why he was constantly being accused of reintroducing legalism into Reformed soteriology, when his purpose of promoting holiness among Reformed people was so demonstrably right. Close quote. C.F. Allison, in his volume The Rise of Moralism, The Proclamation of the Gospel from Hooker to Baxter, published in 1966, I think offered a more accurate assessment of Baxter's doctrine of justification as a virtual return to Tridentine Romanism. In 1998, Carl Trueman noted the need for interpreters of Baxter's theology to account for its medieval roots. You should see his essay, A Small Step Toward Rationalism, the impact of the metaphysics of Tommaso Campanella on the theology of Richard Baxter. And you can see that in the volume Protestant Scholasticism, Essays in Reassessment. And see also Trueman's comments in The Claims of Truth, John Owen's Trinitarian Theology, published in 1998. And look at pages 200 to 205. Even Hans Boersma concedes that Baxter made evangelical obedience, quote, a secondary part of the condition of the continuation of justification. If there's something that we have to do in order to continue our justification, then we're no longer in the Reformation.
This is the Heidelcast.
The Heidelcast.
Boersma also says that Baxter's denial that faith receives Christ's righteousness directly made room for human fulfillment of the conditions of the covenant by the, quote, peppercorn, close quote, of evangelical obedience for justification. We are declared righteous partly because we are intrinsically righteous. Again, this is Baxter's theology. Our works are a, quote, condition of continued and consummate justification, close quote. Even to Boersma's sympathetic analysis of Baxter, there's enough evidence to sustain Allison's judgment. Joel Beakey and Randall Peterson conclude about Baxter's doctrine of salvation, quoting here, Baxter's writings are a strange theological mix. He was one of a few Puritans whose doctrines of God's decrees, atonement, and justification were anything but Reformed. Though he generally structured his theology along Reformed lines of thought, he frequently leaned towards Arminian thinking. He developed his own notion of universal redemption, which offended Calvinists, but retained a form of personal election which offended Arminians. He rejected reprobation. He was greatly influenced by the Amyraldians and incorporated much of their thinking, including hypothetical universalism, which teaches that Christ hypothetically died for all men, but his death only has real benefit to those who believe. For Baxter, Christ's death was more of a legal satisfaction of the law than a personal substitutionary death on behalf of elect sinners, close quote. One must read quite a bit before finding that Baxter's soteriology was as damaging as Arminius's and Amyros. Yet Reformed people continue to write about Baxter in a way that they would never write about Arminius. So the real question here is this: how does this lead get buried? Judging by past experience, when readers new to the Heidelblog or to the Heidelcast hear this sort of thing, many of them will be shocked to read or to hear that Baxter denied the Protestant doctrine of justification. How could they not know that? Well, that fact has been known since the 17th century when John Owen refuted him. It was known before that, even. The first part of the answer is that Baxter was never condemned by an international Reformed synod the way Arminius was. In this respect, we have roughly the same problem with Baxter that we have with Moses Amyro, who died in 1664. Amyro's fairly radical revisions to the doctrines of election and the atonement, as well as his rationalism, were never formally condemned. The French Reformed churches were unable to reach a judgment, even though over time a strong consensus developed among the confessional Reformed that Amyro's revisions constituted a significant threat to orthodoxy. J.H. Heidegger, who died in 1698, and Francis Turretin, who died in 1687, condemned Amyro's revisions, and the Swiss Reformed churches confessed in the Helvetic Consensus Formula of 1675 against Amyro until the broad, non-confessional evangelicals in Geneva, including Turretin's son, rejected the confession in the early 18th century. To be sure, there's no way to square the doctrine we confess in the Westminster Standards with Baxter's doctrine of justification. The inference is clear to anyone willing to pull the lever, but many don't draw the correct inference. And this leads us to the second part of the problem. Not all of us who identify as Reformed either understand or agree that the doctrine of justification is, as Calvin wrote, the hinge around which the Christian faith spins. Nor do we agree with Luther and Alsted that it is the doctrine of the standing or falling of the church. The way people talk about Baxter often is a perfect example of the marginalization of the doctrine of justification. Its corruption is not presented as fatal to the church, but as a source of irritation. An ill-fitting shirt is irritating, but arsenic is fatal. Baxter's doctrine of justification wasn't a scratchy shirt. It was theological arsenic.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
The third part of the problem is the adjective Puritan. Baxter is always labeled a Puritan. And the moment that happens, then the reader assumes that Baxter's soteriology must have been orthodox. In philosophy, the way we often use the adjective Puritan is called a universal. A universal has certain qualities, and those qualities are imputed to everything that falls under that category. The problem with the category Puritan, however, is that there are too many discrepancies between the residents who live in that house. They're not really a family. The adjective Puritan is about as useful as the adjective evangelical is today. Think of it. Do self-described evangelicals agree about much? No. There's no common doctrine of Scripture, God, man, Christ, salvation, church, or last things. The only thing about which self-described evangelicals agree is that they loved Jesus, even though they vary wildly about who he was and what he did. But roughly the same sorts of discrepancies are true of the adjective Puritan. Baxter and Owen shared a view of the church and ecclesiology, but they shared little else. Owen was an Orthodox evangelical in the old-fashioned sense of the word, the 16th and 17th century sense of the word. He was a Protestant, Reformed, congregational minister and theologian who was as passionate for Reformed orthodoxy as he was for Reformed piety. Yet we call both Baxter and Owen Puritans. Well, we can hardly attribute the adjective Puritan to William Perkins, who died in 1602, who was a resolutely Reformed minister and theologian who didn't separate from the Church of England, and to Richard Baxter, without equivocating on the meaning of the word Puritan. So we could go on and keep doing this, but I think you get my point. As long as we continue to use the word Puritan to describe Baxter and Orthodox people, then people will continue to be confused. And so the last part of the problem is that which ostensibly united the Puritans, despite all their many differences: piety. By leading with piety, we create a misleading picture about Reformed theology, piety, and practice. Our piety is the product of our theology. When we lead with piety, we unintentionally give the impression that so long as a fellow was pious, then the rest of what he did and said is less important. And that's just false. Arius was pious as far as anyone knows. Pelagius was famous for his piety. Arminius was pious, but they were all condemned for gross theological errors that ultimately overshadowed their piety. So it's past time we stopped giving Richard Baxter a pass because of his piety. At the very least, doing so is unfair to Arminius and the many others who've been condemned by the church. Logically, it's known as special pleading. Further, does the evidence really support our assessment of his piety? What were the fruits of his theology, right, for the piety of Kidderminster, his parish? Within less than a century after his death, the Kidderminster congregation he served was split, and it became formally Unitarian. The congregation traces its roots to Baxter. Is that fair? It is insofar as Baxter was a rationalist. It was rationalism, the putting of reason above the Scriptures, that drove his revision of evangelical Protestant soteriology. By evangelical here, I mean Reformation. That rationalism first manifested itself in his doctrine of salvation, but rationalism, like water, always seeks its lowest level. The Remonstrants, with whom Baxter shared so much, were also rationalists, and many of them became Unitarians, and they did so even more quickly than did Kidderminster, Baxter's parish. The same rationalism that has us accepted with God because of our holiness cannot tolerate a God who is mysteriously one in three persons, nor a Christ who is one person with two natures.
The Heidelcast.
I understand that there's great concern today about the rise of a new antinomianism, but Richard Baxter should not be our model any more than Arminius should be our model. We admire aspects of the piety of Ignatius of Loyola, but we don't follow him. Baxter's identification with Congregationalists, or the dissenters in 17th century England, and his quest for piety and godliness does not qualify him as a pattern for Reformed ministry and preaching any more than Loyola's does. In case you don't know, Ignatius of Loyola is the founder of the Jesuits. Baxter disqualified himself as a model of Reformed ministry the moment he abandoned and corrupted the heart of our ministry and the source of true Christian piety, the message of God's free grace in Christ and salvation, sola gratia, sola fide. The lead of any story about Richard Baxter must be that he compromised the article of the standing or falling of the church. Everything else we say about him has to come after that.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast. The Heidelcast.